This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 497 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the questions this week, did you know that there are plenty of opportunities to play NASCAR Daily Fantasy over at FanDuel? This weekend, you can set a lineup of drivers for the Blue Emu Maximum Pain Relief 500, which is definitely a race. For less than $5, you can compete for a chance to win a part of the $60,000 prize pool, with first place taking home $10,000. Head over to FanDuel today and set your lineup. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. First question this week is from @It'sThatBoy75. Thoughts on Mixon after Giovanni Bernard was released? Will he be more involved in the passing game? So back at the beginning of the offseason, I did an episode on buy candidates, players I'm looking to trade for this offseason. And one of the running backs that I was looking to trade for was Joe Mixon, and it was for a couple of reasons. One was that this Giovanni Bernard release seemed inevitable. But aside from that, Mixon's numbers this past year were better than people realize, specifically his receiving numbers. And that's usually the knock for Mixon from a fantasy perspective. 2 of his 6 games played last year saw target shares of 17% and 28%. His prorated target share last season would have yielded a 12.6% share. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that at the running back position. And that's in an offense that's been really pass heavy under Zach Taylor. Now there's no Bernard, and the last time we saw Mixon without Bernard, he saw a big boost in receiving volume. It may not be totally relevant, but there was a 4-game stretch without Bernard in 2018 from weeks 5 through 8. Those are the only games Bernard's missed since Joe Mixon entered the league. In those games, Mixon finishes the RB 11, 11, 32, and 4. He averaged 19 PPR points per game. His target share per game was 14.6%, and his lowest target share in any game during that stretch was 12.5%. Now, I've never thought that Joe Mixon was some bad receiver. The usage just wasn't as good as what we'd like. But that usage should be there this year, barring something crazy happening in the draft. He's been a buy and he's still a buy, though I would expect his cost to rise a little bit now. This next question is from @FF_disguise. Hey JJ, now that the NFL has expanded the number of games, would love to get your thoughts about how you see it affecting things in fantasy. Does adding one extra game do much? For example, could it make the argument to lean into something like 0 RB even more? And then I also got one from @PardonMyFrench that says, how should we handle projections with the change to 17 games? Do you assume a full 17 games for each player, rest, something else? Thanks. So I think both of these questions are very, very valid. And I don't have a super analytical answer for these questions. I'm in the process of building out projections right now, so I have them for draft night. And one of the things that I'm keeping in mind specifically is how teams are going to manage their running back's workload. Like, I think a player can maintain a strong target share at wide receiver across an entire season, across a full 17-game season. An extra game may not change anything, aside from maybe an increased injury risk, only because they're playing an additional game. That means there's more opportunity to get hurt. But realistically, a team could save their lead running back a little bit more. It's impossible to know exactly what that number is, though. It's impossible to know the degree in which a team may not give their top running back a full workload. But my approach to projections is going to slightly change. Like, instead of looking at a 16-game projection and just adding a game's worth of statistics, I'll likely be bumping down the rush share for some of the higher-end running backs who are bound to see large rushing shares. It won't be dramatic enough to drastically change your draft strategy. At least I don't think so. But it could allow traditional backups or traditional handcuffs to see more work throughout the year. Their production may not be predictable, but they may see more work, and that might allow them to be more usable in a best ball format. It's just a tough one to answer right now because we don't have any data on what this will look like across 17 games. But with a lot of people asking this, I figured I'd at least give my general thoughts on the topic. The next question is from @J_Swizzy. Do you think Kyle Pitts has a good shot to buck the trend of tight ends taking a couple of years to produce for fantasy? Obviously, landing spot will help determine that, but where do you currently have him ranked? I don't have rankings yet, but sure, I think that he has a good shot. People are going to say that Pitts is overvalued in redraft this year, and he might be. He might end up being drafted higher than I expect once July and August hits. But the name of the game with tight end in particular is upside. I want sincere upside with my tight ends in fantasy football. And I don't know how he wouldn't have that kind of upside versus other tight ends that you might be drafting in his draft area or where his ADP will fall. He's one of the best receiving tight end prospects we've seen in recent history, or at least he's in the conversation. So as of today, I'm all for it as long as his ADP doesn't get out of control. Tight end is a tough transition, but it's also a shallow position. Even when we think it's deep, it's usually not deep. So I think Kyle Pitts, as long as he's a late round tight end or a late-ish round tight end, I think he makes sense as a target because the upside is obviously there. We have to see what his landing spot is though. This next question is from @StarChucker. DJ Moore affected with the Sam Darnold trade? I was hopeful they would draft the long-term answer instead of going after Darnold. So I'm sure you all saw the deal that went down earlier in the week with Sam Darnold going to Carolina. I've been torn on Darnold for a while. I lean on the side that he's not very good because generally speaking, how a quarterback performs early in his career tells us a lot about his career trajectory and what it's going to look like. But at the same time, the players who sort of buck that trend are the ones who had some sort of change in scenery, like Drew Brees or Alex Smith. And that's what Darnold's getting. And he's getting that after having one of the worst situations around him to start his NFL career. The one thing that scares me, though, that's more numbers driven, and probably the reason I lean towards him not being any sort of answer, is his clean pocket numbers. Last season in a clean pocket, Darnold was dead last according to Pro Football Focus and quarterback rating. He was worse than Carson Wentz. He was middle of the pack in 2019. That's not exactly a great endorsement. So I lean more towards selling Darnold in this idea that he's the next Ryan Tannehill. But I'm not blind to the fact that he's getting massive upgrades everywhere. His pass catchers are better. His coordinator's better. He hasn't had that much to work with so far in his career. So there's at least some upside there. I'd rather take that upside for DJ Moore than have another year with Teddy Bridgewater. The thing with Moore, though, is that he's never really had great quarterback play. He's been in the league for 3 years now. So 2 of those years were when he wasn't a rookie. And in those 2 years, he played with Kyle Allen and Teddy Bridgewater. Kyle Allen was 3rd worst in clean pocket passer rating in 2019. And then this past year, Teddy Bridgewater was just pretty average. Bridgewater was mostly replacement level, even when you look at his deep ball numbers and how aggressive he was. But over the last 2 years, Moore has been super solid. He's hit well over 1,100 receiving yards in both seasons. He's actually just one of 7 players with 1,100 or more receiving yards in each of the last 2 years. And he's actually the only wide receiver with 1,200 or more yards from scrimmage over this time. DJ Moore is really good. He's quarterback proof. And at least with Darnold, there's more of this unknown ceiling. So I like him there more than the alternatives currently in the league. I like Darnold more than Teddy Bridgewater. But for Moore's case, I would have loved for Carolina to go trade up for something and lock in one of the quarterbacks from this year's draft class. That would have been a better solution for DJ Moore, and probably the Panthers too, than Sam Darnold. So overall, it's probably pretty lateral for Moore. He's still someone that's a very solid fantasy asset, especially with Curtis Samuel no longer there. This next question is from @BlueandWhite1. In a single quarterback dynasty league and assuming Pitts and Chase are off the board, who would be the best player available? Harris, Lawrence, Bateman, or Marshall? Given that it's a 1 quarterback league and a weak running back class, I'm feeling unsure on how to approach this at the 103 spot. So I don't think that we should put Pitts and Chase as the 101 and the 102 in this class unless you're working within an environment where tight ends get some sort of scoring boost. I can understand Chase as the top pick, but not Pitts in a normal league format given the value of the tight end position in fantasy football. I love Kyle Pitts, but tight ends don't matter as much as running backs and wide receivers do. And Trevor Lawrence shouldn't be up there either because it's a single quarterback league. The position just is not meaningful enough. The real reason I wanted to keep this question for the show, though, is the piece about the weak running back class. Yes, it is a weak running back class overall. It's not as deep as last year's. But the top end of the draft is absolutely fine. Whether you're talking about Najee Harris, Travis Etienne, or even Javonte Williams. I actually think that Harris and Etienne are the 101 and the 102 in rookie drafts this year, and that they're in the same tier as Jamar Chase. So it's a bad running back class in total, but there are still very good running backs in this class. This next question is from @H1512_. Love the show, JJ. And then in parentheses, he says, thanks. My league is stubborn about not moving draft day up, primarily because someone always gets hurt in the preseason. Being a free agent budget league, what do you think of assigning free agent budget compensation according to what round that player is drafted and hurt before week 1? Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, if a player gets hurt in the preseason, depending on the round that player was drafted in, you'd then give that manager who has that player more free agent dollars to play with. Now, I think that's a fun enough wrinkle, but I don't think it's entirely necessary. People get really irritated by early drafts because of what's being noted in this question. But early drafts will often benefit the managers who know what they're doing. When they're early on players, they're benefiting. If they like a player before his ADP rises due to preseason play or some other factor, then they should be rewarded for that. And the argument, I think, against this idea of adding free agent dollars to teams who had injured players in the preseason is, why are we separating the preseason from the regular season? If a player gets hurt during the final preseason game versus week 1, why is that so much different? Like, yeah, it sucks when you draft in late July and your first round draft selection tears his ACL on August 5th. That if you had just drafted on August 6th, you would have never taken that player. But players get injured all the time early in the season as well. And that's when all drafts are already completed. That's just part of this game. That brings variance to fantasy football. Early drafts can be really, really good for people who know their stuff. It brings more time for injuries to occur over the month of August, but drafting late isn't always the best solution. And because of that, I don't think it's necessary to add a rule like this, unless you just want another fun thing to track before the season starts. If that's the case, go for it. This next question is from @LukeAngelica1. How come you rarely talk about a prospect model for quarterback or tight end? Is it because they are onesie positions, or does it have to do with the availability of consistent data and or metrics? Will you ever come up with a model down the road? Thanks, love the pod. Thanks. So I only have models for running back and wide receiver, so I don't do it for quarterback and tight end. And the reason for that is because modeling for quarterback and tight end, I found it to be pretty hard. And I've worked over the last few years on making the receiver and running back models pretty strong because those are the positions that matter most for fantasy purposes. Quarterback is really tough to evaluate, and it's hard to find concrete data points that help predict success. And tight end often comes down to opportunity and athleticism in the NFL. There are so many different ways that teams utilize their tight ends. That makes them harder to prospect. I know some people have found success for those positions, but I just haven't had the time or ability to sit down and create models for them yet. That's just my honest answer. But hopefully I'll get to it someday. The last question this week is from @DaveHog17. Who are your biggest sleepers being drafted in the 3rd to 4th round in rookie drafts? So I'll use DynastyLeagueFootball.com's ADP to answer this question. So I'll look at picks 25, the beginning of round 3, through 48. I thought I was going to be lower than the consensus on Trey Sermon. I think I talked about that on a previous podcast. He's ranked 25th overall right now. But I think he's going to end up being a 2nd round pick in rookie drafts once this draft is over. He's got the right size in a class that doesn't have a lot of potential workhorses, and I think we may see his draft capital end up being better than expected. And that's huge at the running back position. He's just a volatile prospect because we don't have a huge sample on him. And I've been a Kylan Hill guy throughout this entire process as well. I'm just expecting him to be a day 3 pick. I don't mind him as a dart throw though, because his overall analytical profile is actually pretty decent. He has good size. He has a really good receiving profile with that size too. That combination makes him really intriguing. And then at wide receiver in this group, how about Nico Collins? This wide receiver class has a lot of smaller pass catchers. But Collins is 6'4", he weighs 215 pounds, he has good athleticism measurables for what that's worth, he's an early declare, and he has a good breakout age. His production profile isn't flawless. It's not great. But for a dart throw, I think Collins is the right kind of pass catcher to target late. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you next week.